But Aunt Geraldine, I said serenely, you yourself said it was best that I didn't marry him. That was before he showed up tonight looking as innocent as fresh snow. What were you thinking, letting him just get away? You could have solved all our problems by marrying that boy. She took out her lace hanky and started wiping her cheeks. And now our family will be joined to the Burnsides instead. It's nothing less than infamous. Anne said, Look, Mrs. Gilroy has already cornered Timothy. In unison, we all turned to see Timothy surrounded by every female belonging to the Gilroy family. Like many of the guests, they had removed their itchy masks, even though it was not yet midnight. Mrs. Gilroy was in raptures as Judith amused Timothy with some humorous story. Timothy's laughter carried like his father's, and we weren't the only ones watching with interest. I started to say something flippant and airy about it to Jane, only to remember that Judith was 3 inches taller than I and was renowned for her vivid blue eyes. A settled silence fell over our little corner of the room. Revenge or no revenge, did he have to have such a good time with another girl? Lawrence and Tori chose this opportunity to stop by our party. Look at them, Lawrence said, gesturing to us. Did you ever see such a glum flock of birds? And haven't we a right to be glum? Aunt Geraldine said. This is by far the worst ball I have ever had the misfortune of attending. There, Tori said brightly. How can any of you be sad when after tonight we may start planning a wedding? Lisbette, it's time you danced with me. Not right now, Tori, I said irritably. I'm tired. He tried to put his hand on my shoulder, but I swatted it off. Don't touch me. Now see here, Lisbette, he started to say. Tori Burnside, Timothy said out of nowhere. I hear you're to be congratulated. Tori had to look up at Timothy to meet his eyes. His nose twitched. What do you mean? They say you've come into money. You're a rich man, according to my father. Oh, that, Tori said, visibly relaxing. Yes, my grandfather died, and I was named heir. Timothy held out his hand. An inheritance. That's marvelous news. With a smug smile, Tori took Timothy's outstretched hand. Thank you. What are you going to buy with all that money? Timothy asked, giving Tori's hand a good pumping. Oh, you know, Tori said. I was thinking about a pair of 4 to start with. You'll need a good set of wheels if you go that route. Are you sure horses won't clean you out? Not at all. I've already purchased my vehicle. And your mother, she'll be wanting you to get married now, I'm sure. Any thoughts of matrimony? The thought had crossed my mind, he said, carefully glancing down at his hand, which was still firmly clasped in Timothy's. Well, Timothy said slowly, think long and hard before you choose. Long and hard. Tori swallowed and said nothing. Plenty of girls to select from in Easton. Make sure you don't choose the wrong one. Tori shook his head, and I saw the beads of sweat on his upper lip. At last Timothy let go of Tori's hand. Tori's fingers were a bright red and white, and I quietly exulted. I shook out my dress and stood up because it was time for Timothy to ask me to dance. But Timothy only turned to Lawrence. Having a good time tonight? Naturally, the Eastons never disappoint. But what about you, old boy? Got yourself into quite a scrape, haven't you? Timothy folded his arms and watched the dancers. Not so bad as you might think. Not nearly as bad as the trouble a person can get into playing cards, or so I hear. Lawrence frowned and peeked furtively at his mother before answering. I wouldn't know. I rarely touch the stuff. Good man. They say you can lose an entire fortune down that road. Is that what they say? The big clock beside the fireplace struck 11, and Timothy didn't even flinch. But I was not made of stone. I stepped near to him to show that I was ready for him to take me to the dance floor. Timothy smoothly turned to Jane and said, May I have the honor of dancing? Caught by surprise, Jane looked to me for help, but I could only stare at the both of them. Finding no aid, she meekly answered Timothy. Thank you. I should like that. Aunt Geraldine whispered to me in suppressed excitement. Maybe our luck hasn't turned after all, if he should take to Jane. I couldn't listen to it any more. I said to Tori, I think I'm ready to dance after all. Startled, Tori stopped rubbing his fingers and smiled. Well, that's more like it. I hoped with all my might that Timothy was watching as Tori and I joined the dance, but not once did I ever catch his eye. I went through the dance steps with a jerky irritation. In 1 hour, the betrothal that had bound us together since we were children was going to end. Doubts began to creep back into my mind. Jane was right. I couldn't wait until midnight for Timothy to declare himself. I must tell him that I loved him or risk losing him forever. But the hour was creeping by. The quadrille ended and a waltz was started. Gary Gilroy asked me for the pleasure, but he was soon sorry. I lost my timing twice and nearly tripped over my own shoes because I kept looking at the clock instead of at my partner. When the final chord of music struck, Gary thanked me coolly and offered to take me back to my seat. To my dismay, George was by my side before I could even sit down. Will you do me the honor? He said, holding out his hand. His cravat was a bit crooked now, and he had the look on his face of a man who was not enjoying the ball. I looked at the clock in dismay. I'm afraid I get to claim that honor, Timothy said, appearing from behind me. After all, she's still mine until midnight, at least on paper. Faint with relief, I smiled gratefully at him. To George, I said, I'm sorry, Captain Hargrove, but I did have Timothy down for this dance. I actually had Thomas Easton, but that seemed a minor detail at the moment. George frowned at both of us. Well then, enjoy the moment, while it lasts. Timothy watched him go and then took my hand. Trying hard to compose my nerves, I said as calmly as I could, I thought you'd forgotten me. It's been a busy evening, he said carelessly. The music started up again and began to dance. I said, do you really know what you're doing? Or are you actually going to let George take you away in the next few hours? Timothy seemed to think the question was rhetorical because he simply continued to dance, smiling down at me as calm and cool as a summer's morning. I won't forgive you if you go without a fight, I warned. Why would I need to fight? Because you're innocent. So what are you worried about? Richard told me they could take you away without even a trial, that you could disappear and that no one would even know where you had gone. Would it comfort you to know that I'm not planning on disappearing? It might, I said. Are you going to tell me what your plan is? Look, he said, nodding to the clock, it's nearly midnight. Do you know what that means? I held my breath. It means you're almost 21. My mother will send you a posy of orchids tomorrow to mark the occasion. Ah, I see the Kents have arrived. I was wondering if we'd be seeing them tonight. Fashionably late as always. I had no interest in the Kents, but since Timothy was so glad to see them, and with his bad ear only inches away, what was I to do? I couldn't tell him to his face that I desperately wanted him to remember the contract. So I did the only thing I could do. I stood up on my tiptoes and whispered into his deaf ear, Timothy, I'm in love with you. I wonder if Kent will ask to sell my hunters again, he said, looking back at me. I never see him, but he makes me an offer. I smiled a reply. For the rest of the dance, he never once mentioned the contract. Coward, I called myself. Why couldn't I make myself say the words that needed to be said aloud? But I knew why. I could not coerce Timothy into marrying me, for to do so would be to doubt his regard for me for the rest of my life. No, if Timothy refused to speak of the contract to me, then I could not bring myself to remind him. Last night I had thought that perhaps, but no, how could I expect him to really be in love with me after the way I had treated him all these years? Jane was right. I'd done too good a job convincing him and everyone in the county that I'd never marry him. The dance ended. He walked me off the floor and then bowed his goodbye. I think I started to say something, but he turned and spoke. Oh, I forgot one thing. My heart leaped. Yes? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fat envelope. For a fraction of a moment I forgot about the clock and the betrothal, because I recognized that envelope. It was the envelope that Gerard had given to me to take to the bank back in Audleton. It was the envelope that had vanished almost as it were into thin air. I took it into my hand and stared at it. Where? How? As soon as you told me what happened with the money, I immediately suspected Clay's. I peered up at him, speechless. He and Lawrence have always been thick together, he said, as if this would explain everything. But when I still couldn't make my mind work, he patiently continued to explain it to me. When I made it back to Easton, my head scabbed over with blood, Father sent for John Bigby. I knew John treated several of the miners from Stonebridge, so I asked him if he had heard any rumors about Lawrence. Sure enough, he had. It was as I had expected. Lawrence is so deep in debt that his life isn't worth the price of his teeth. All I had to do after that was to send a couple of men to wait for Clays on the road home. Clays obliged me by showing up this evening. It wasn't hard to persuade him to confess. He told my men everything about how Lawrence had convinced his father to let Clays go with Gerard to Audleton. Once there, Clays easily talked Gerard into staying at the hotel. While Clays accompanied you to the bank, he believed all along that Gerard would be blamed for the lost money. He glanced over to where Lawrence was mingling with the Gilroys. I'm afraid Lawrence is in for a bit of a disappointment tomorrow morning, but somehow I can't make myself care. My head was still spinning. Clays stole the money? Well, you were on the phone in the car, so there you have it, the money to pay the taxes. The clock struck 12. He smiled and kissed my hand. Many happy returns. I looked at the clock and then back at him, too befuddled to even close my gaping mouth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go and speak to some of the other guests. That was all. Not another word, not one sentimental salute to the contract that had ended seconds ago. He merely walked off and greeted the Hancock brothers, who eagerly started questioning him about the King's Guard. Soon he was lost in the crowd, and I could no longer see the man I had formerly been engaged to all my life.